I was told by firefighters.
Pat Dawson, let's go to you in Lower Manhattan. You have a report of another bomb.
All right, Tom, we've just been told we're being evacuated. You can see all the emergency workers walking north on the West Side Highway in New York. We've been told by firefighters here that there is a report of a bomb in this building. This is a school, a high school right here. And as you can see, they're moving everybody away from this building. They've said that there's a bomb in the building. They are evacuating us north now. That is according to firefighters on the scene. And we're going to move out of here right now just to keep ourselves safe. So we're going to start walking north ourselves. But that's what we're being told by New York City firefighters here, that there were reports of a bomb in that high school right there. It's called Stuyvesant High School. And so we are walking north to get out of the way. You can see just to my left here, these are even the ambulances which were down there are being moved north. The firefighters are being moved north. Everybody is being moved north. We're being asked by the police now to go north and get out of the way. Officer, do you have any idea of what the problem is?
There's a report of a secondary device possibly in the area of this school, so they're going to move everybody back as a precaution.
Secondary device meaning a bomb?
Possibly.
Okay, and where did that report come from? Was it called in?
It came in over our radios, and it's reported through our supervisors on down, so we're pulling everybody back.
And that's in the Stuyvesant High School right there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Officer McQuaid.
Pat,
that's Officer McQuaid of New York City Emergency Service.
Pat, that school has been evacuated?
Yeah, well, I don't think there was anyone in the school, Katie, this morning. At this point, I think everybody had been evacuated from here probably when the first events took place early this morning, just because of the fact that it's so close to the World Trade Center. Most of these buildings around here have been evacuated, so I would imagine, I never saw any kids going into that school this morning, so I'm going to presume that they never even allowed them to get to school this morning, and that anywhere that were here at 8:45 were probably moved out almost within moments after the crash took place, because it literally is only about 10 blocks north of here, and I haven't seen any students coming in or out.
All right, Pat Dawson, thank you very much. The big story, obviously, that is still to be resolved is how many planes were hijacked. We now have a report that there could have been as many as 4 of them. We know that 2 planes were involved here at the Twin Trade Towers. There's a report of a plane down north of Pittsburgh. Another kind of plane went into the Pentagon, but there could still be planes in the air that are under the control of hijackers. We don't know for sure what flights they are or where they're headed. There are some unconfirmed reports of them. We can only tell you that American 11 and American 77 have been identified by American Airlines as 2 of the planes that were involved in the incidents today.
And the hijackings are scattered somewhat around a fairly wide area, and we just have to remember that 2 of these planes did arrive at the World Trade Center within 18 or 20 minutes of each other, just to, again, point out the coordination of this attack. We're going to go down to NBC's Tim Russert, who is standing by with more information. Tim? Tim? Apparently Tim can't hear us.
All right, obviously people are scrambling to get as much information. I think we do now
Tim,
have
do you
Tim's
hear us?
audio. Tim?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
Please give us your information.
I've been just speaking to the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Porter Goss, and we're trying to get him on the telephone here and continue our conversation on the air. He told me that he was on the phone with House Speaker Hastert about the situation when a code red was declared on the Hill, that the Speaker has moved to a secure place because he is in the line of command of our national leadership. Congressman Porter Goss, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, also said that this extremely well-coordinated attack could only be done by a very few people, very few organizations, and that because of the magnitude of it, it will be relatively easy to, quote, see their fingerprints. And then we as a nation are going to have to make a very decisive retaliation as soon as we are able to identify exactly who this was. Mr. Goss said he's obviously never seen anything quite like this. As it plays out, perhaps more to come. And he will be joining us shortly on the telephone here so we all can hear his words directly. He will be brief throughout the day because of his position. He has access to the nation's utmost secrets.
All right, Tim, obviously President Bush is on his way back to the nation's capital. Is it your understanding that he has arrived yet, or do you know his whereabouts at this point?
Katie, I do not know that, but I do know that while the White House has been evacuated, the Situation Room continues. There are people in the White House doing their jobs, and so with the Pentagon. In the nerve centers of both of those facilities, our highest-ranking officials are obviously monitoring this situation, making a determination as just how widespread this attack may be, and trying very, very hard to get a handle on exactly who did it and just how we respond.
Tim, we have secure areas, obviously, for the president in case of a nuclear attack in the past, in the mountains of Virginia, not too far from Washington, by helicopter ride. Any indication that the president may have to go to one of those facilities?
We have not yet heard that, Tom. I asked that question, and the response was, we're not going there, meaning responding to my question, not necessarily traveling there. But they obviously are on the highest state of alert. They understand the magnitude of this. They understand that the American people now are going to be waiting and watching for a response from Washington other than what the president gave in Florida. As you might expect, even our most sophisticated communications 2001 era, it is still extremely difficult trying to get any kinds of information. The cell phones are down, many of the hard lines are down, but I've been assured by people at the White House and at the Pentagon that in fact they are in touch with each other and have the situation is under control the best they can, but like all of us, they simply don't know yet who did this.
Tim, you talked about Porter Goss. Obviously, the Capitol was evacuated along with other major monuments and major government buildings in Washington, D.C. Where are people, members of Congress, right now? Have they assembled anywhere, and what are they doing, and where are they?
Katie, after the explosion at the World Trade Center, Congress convened, said a prayer, and then recessed. And many of the members headed home. They were obviously going to look forward to a very difficult week in Washington dealing with the economy. I'm told Porter Goss is on the telephone now with me. Congressman, can you hear me? Congressman Goss, can you hear me? We'll continue to effort that, Katie. But most of the congressmen have now, and congresswomen have returned to their homes here in Washington because the building itself has been evacuated. The leadership of the Congress, as I mentioned, Speaker Hassert particularly, is in a secure place, and he will be in constant communication with the President and Vice President, being the third person in the hierarchy.
All right, Tim Russert in Washington. Tim, thanks very much, and when you get Porter Goss on the phone, maybe you can give us some more information. Thanks, Tim.
We'll be right back to you.
All right, let's go now to MSNBC's Ashley Banfield, who's in Lower Manhattan, standing by with some people who were either inside those buildings or near the buildings when those planes hit. Ashley?
Yeah, hi. I am just about between 5 and 10 blocks north of the actual site of where those two towers have come down. We're obviously having a bit of trouble right now maintaining our location because we just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard. The police are telling us they're either car bombs or they are simply cars that have overheated so much that they're exploding. But every time one of those happens, there's a flurry of activity, and there are more emergency vehicles that come down this road. I don't know if you can shoot past me and shoot down into that black cloud in there. That is the cloud that we were in just about 45 minutes ago or so. At the time we were there, when the first trade tower came down, my producer and I were overcome by the cloud of debris and smoke that came at us so rapidly. We had to break down a window to an apartment building. We had to break the window and go into the second door inside just to breathe. We were followed by a police officer and a security guard from the World Trade Center area. I want to show you something if I can. I'm just using a cell phone so that I can hear you because there are no cell lines that are coming out of Manhattan at the time, but see if you can zero in on this right here. This is the kind of debris that we're seeing all over the ground. If you can see the address, 1 World Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center, Trade Center.
Okay, obviously we're having some technical problems with Ashley Banfield, who is on the ground near the World Trade Center about 5 blocks away.
All right, here's the first confirmation from United Airlines. It's confirmed one of its flights crashed in the Pittsburgh area. Flight 93, a Boeing 757, a flight involved originating in Newark. It was bound for San Francisco. No information on how many people were on board. A 757 carries a lot of folks. Anyone who's flown from Newark to San Francisco knows that most of those flights carry a full load.
Okay, so this now brings to 3 the number of confirmed flights that have been involved in this tragic day. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, Flight 77 from Washington Dulles Airport to Los Angeles with 58 passengers on board, and now the United flight, Tom, that you just mentioned. And you can say that we have to say that the number of passengers was relatively low on those first flights, and we can only hope this was not a full flight, this United flight.
You know, there was a collapse, obviously, not just of intelligence, but of airport security as well, that many planes were hijacked almost simultaneously.
Although these days, as we know, Tom, and learned from the TWA tragedy, Flight 800, that oftentimes some of these devices are absolutely, it's impossible to see them in our kind of security X-ray machines that you have at typical airports. Some are made of plastiques. They can be very small and virtually undetectable, which is, of course, another major problem for airport security. We're going to go to Bob Bazell, who is at St. Vincent's Hospital. Obviously, we're very concerned about the people who were in the World Trade Center when these two planes crashed into them. Bob, tell me about the scene at St. Vincent's Hospital.
Katie, the wounded are starting to come in with great regularity now. Almost every 30 seconds an ambulance pulls up. Some of them are very badly burned. Some are dead. I've seen several dead bodies go in. Cardinal Egan, the head of the Catholic Archdiocese, is standing out on the street giving last rites. Said, "May God help us," many times over. There's been a call out for blood from all the New York hospitals. People are lined up around the block. People have responded in enormous numbers to that. Everybody seems to want to help in some way. New York has become kind of surrealistic on the streets above Lower Manhattan because all the subways and commuter lines and bridges and tunnels have been shut down, so many people who are not injured are wandering around aimlessly. But in the hospitals, there's so many injured coming in now that they don't have run out of gurneys, and they brought every office chair that they have down and put sheets over that to carry people in. It's an enormous amount of work for all the staff. People have come in. Everybody who was off has been come in. Calls have gone out for specialists, for plastic surgeons, for burn specialists, and it's going to be a very grueling several days ahead.
Well, Bob, the other thing is that I don't know whether you can tell about traffic in the rest of Manhattan, because a lot of our major hospitals are well north of there. Lenox Hill, Columbia Presbyterian, New York Cornell. Are the ambulances able to get through? Have they cleared the traffic? We're in kind of a tomb here in the studios in Midtown.
Tom, I had trouble hearing you just that time. There's a system in place here where there's triaging people down in Lower Manhattan. They're putting sometimes tags around their neck to show some people you see wandering up from Lower Manhattan who have only slight injuries, who have been cleared. Others are very seriously injured. Every hospital in the area is involved in a plan to take in some kind of patients. This one where I'm at, St. Vincent's, is one of the closest with a major trauma center. But every hospital is on alert. Every hospital is just taking in what is becoming now a sea of patients.
All right, NBC's Robert Bazell. Bob, thanks very much. Let's go back to Washington and NBC's Tim Russert, who has a guest on the phone, Porter Goss, the head of the House Intelligence Committee. Tim?
Exactly right. Congressman Goss, are you there?
I'm here, Tim.
As the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, what is your official reaction to what we witnessed this morning?
Well, obviously, I'm horrified. We do our best to make sure there are no surprises like this happening to Americans at home or abroad. It's never 100% sure, and we got the wake-up call again today. It is unbelievable that anybody would do an act like this, basically using innocent victims aboard our commercial airliners as weapons against other innocent victims in our big buildings, our symbols of economy and commerce in New York, and our defense and legislative and executive buildings here in Washington.
When people are watching this at home, Congressman, they're saying to themselves, how could this happen in the United States of America? A complete breakdown in our airport security, a complete breakdown in our airspace security over the Pentagon, the center of our military command. How could something be this vulnerable?
Well, we are a free, open, democratic society, and we take great pride in that. We pay a price for it. As you know, if you've ever flown into Washington Reagan Airport, you fly right over the Pentagon. And many times we've commented on how vulnerable the building is for just that reason. That vulnerability was taken advantage of today. As for commercial airliners flying around New York and airspace there, obviously they fly near the trade towers. To be able to say that our airport security works 100%, anybody who flies in America knows that's not true. You answer a few questions before you get on the plane and show a photo ID. That doesn't necessarily mean you can't do mayhem on the plane, as we see from time to time. And tragically, some kind of an organization somewhere has orchestrated all this in an effective fashion. We have great intelligence capabilities out there who keep us constantly on alert about these types of reports. I can tell you, I know of no specific reporting anything of this particular specificity on this day with these targets, but I can tell you that we are scrambling all the time to assess information that would do harm to the United States and its people. And as we know, we've seen our military installations subject to attack, our embassy subject to attack before. We stop a lot of it, but obviously we don't get it all, and we're just going to have to rethink how we do business in today's world and deal with these kinds of threats.
Based on your experience as a honored CIA agent and now as a very highly respected chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, how many organizations, terrorist organizations in the world, are capable of pulling off such a coordinated massive attack?
I would say there's only a handful if we're not talking about state-sponsored terrorism. If you're talking state-sponsored, it could be more, but I don't think we're dealing with state-sponsored. I think we're dealing here with a loose network, a loose association of people who have the same goal, which is an anti-United States goal, who have found a way to get together and network and pull this thing off. Part of the problem with terrorism is that one of the weapons of terrorism is confusion. And one of the hopes now, of course, of the terrorists who perpetrated this is that we will have lots of confusion in the United States, and there will be rumors of other things happening, and that will upset how we go about our business and our behavior and how our law enforcement people react and so forth. That's one thing to deal with, and another thing to deal with, as the President alluded to this morning in his very strong statement, was that we will respond. The question is, against whom? And we want to make absolutely sure when we're dealing with asymmetrical warfare such as this, where we're dealing with innocent people, by and large, who are victims of this, that we respond appropriately and not provoke any other incidents that are unwarranted in the world, but get the people who actually cause this to happen. And that requires good information, and obviously we're in the process of trying to get that information.
But it may take some time to
Yes,
sort through all this, find the fingerprints, and in fact launch any kind of retaliation.
That is certainly true, and one of the hallmarks we may need is patience these days.
Congressman Porter Goss, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, we thank you very much. We'll be contacting you throughout the day, and we very much appreciate you joining us this morning.
Well, thank you. Add my prayers to the others.
Thank you much. Back to you, Matt.
All right, Tim, thank you very much. We're going to talk to someone here in the studio in a second, but Tom, you've got a phone number for people who are concerned about passengers on board those flights.
American Airlines has confirmed that 2 of its flights were hijacked, and for people who want to know, the number is 1-800-245-0999. United headquarters, you may not be able to get through, obviously, is 847-700-5538. United has confirmed that one of its planes went down near Pittsburgh. American has said that 2 of its planes were involved in the hijackings today, one from Dulles and one from Boston.
All right,
and apparently United Airlines was involved, is right?
Right.
I said that in Pittsburgh.
Okay, right,
Yeah.
from Newark en route to San Francisco,
Right.
is that right?
Yeah,
Ron Insana is here. Oh, actually, we're
We
going
want
to
to
go
go,
first
just
to
before
Ashley
that, we want to go
Banfield.
downtown again. Ron Insana. Oh, no, okay, we're going to, there we go. Ashley Banfield
We're
has
giving out
someone she's
emergency
talking
numbers
to.
over the airways. No, I know, but we're doing that now.
Yes, that's the only thing.
I just wanted to ask
Ashley,
you.
can you hear me?
For emergency personnel, either law enforcement or medical.
Do you know anything about those extra
No, I do
explosions we
not.
heard?
No, I do not.
Were they car bombs?
I have no idea, ma'am.
Are you being told that we're going to have to move out of this area as well?
I was not told anything relative to that.
What about the sewers? Are they looking for bombs in sewers?
All non-essential personnel. That's all I
Okay.
can tell you.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
obviously, the emergency workers are moving people out of that area. Ron Insana is here with us in the studio. Ron, obviously, you were downtown at some point because we see you have basically soot and debris in your hair and on your jacket. What happened?
Well, one of the MSNBC cameramen and I were trying to get across the street, having driven down to try to cover the event, obviously, for NBC. And as we were going across the street, we were not terribly far from the World Trade Center building, the South Tower. As we were cutting across in a quarantine zone, actually, the building began to disintegrate, and we heard it and looked up and started to see elements of the building come down, and we ran, and honestly, it was like a scene out of Independence Day. Everything began to rain down. It was pitch black around us as the winds were whipping through the corridors in lower Manhattan. I ducked around a corner, got into a car which was open, and it was nighttime for several minutes before things cleared up.
Was this the first tower that
I
collapsed?
believe it was the first tower that collapsed. This was the South Tower, and as it was coming down, what that looks like there is mild compared to what it was like to be at the center. It was pitch black for blocks.
And was it smoke as well as dust?
It was smoke, it was dust. I assume it was part of the building coming down, and just pieces of a disintegrating building coming down as well.
Obviously, we're very concerned about the triage unit that was set up there to help people who are trying to get out of the building, Ron, to help people who had already been carried out of the building and who were being treated medically. Were you close enough to survey the scene at
I was
the
within
foot
about
of the building?
half a block of the building as it started to come down.
Can you tell us what you saw
It
there?
was fairly clear. There were some areas along the street that did have blood and debris. There were no longer people in the area except for a couple of journalists and police officers who were containing the area so people wouldn't cut through.
And once it did begin to clear, after that several minutes of pitch darkness, what did you see in the streets then?
It was a very deep gray smoke. It in honesty, looked like a bit of a nuclear winter, the type of thing you see in the movies with ash all over the ground, on top of cars, on police cars, on windows. I made my way into a building because it was the one light I could see, and stayed there until a couple of police officers and a few of the people inside the building were able to get into a vehicle. We picked up a few injured people along the way and dropped them off at the hospital.
You did. What were their injuries?
Well, one policeman had a deep gash in his forehead. He was all right. He was clearly a bit shocked, and the young lady had shrapnel in her arm. Don't know what it was, whether it was part of a building or glass from another building.
Was there a lot of peripheral damage to other buildings and stores
Not really.
in the area? Because when that building came down, one would only imagine all the pieces of steel and concrete that came cascading down as well and hit other places.
I imagine the collateral damage was enormous, but we were probably, I'd say, 2 or 3 blocks away in a building where we holed up for a time until we were fairly comfortable that it was safe to come out. It was truly the most intense and frightening experience I've ever had in my life. It was literally pitch black on the street, and people were, obviously inhaling a great deal of this material as well, so there are many folks who were having difficulty breathing and were wearing facial masks as well.
Well, we're happy you're all
right. We have
Okay.
United Airlines confirms that United Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles is down as well. No details yet. It's confirmed that Flight 93, we believe from Newark to San Francisco, is down. No details as yet. That's the one that we think went down in the Pittsburgh area. I wish that we could be more specific. The information is, as you might expect, pretty chaotic, but there have been at least 4 airliners that have been hijacked today.
And Tom, there's going to be an awful lot of scrutiny on the security in Boston at Logan Airport because it now appears that 2 of these flights originated there. And somehow someone managed to get on these planes and hijack them.
Well, this is an event, Ron. We're happy to see you. And
thank you. You have no idea how happy I am to be here.
Yeah, it is a relief. But then you think about the experiences of thousands of other people who are down there in the epicenter of all that, and were there when it occurred. Our hearts go out to them. We don't know what the numbers are yet.
And you hear about Cardinal Egan delivering last rites outside of St. Vincent's Hospital.
And the magnitude of this will go on for some time. This is not just a national tragedy, but this is a national security event of an untold magnitude that this country is going to have to deal with. The president's coming back, and we are at war, in effect, here. This country has suffered a devastating attack that will cost us in the sense of in loss of life. It will also cost us in terms of our psychological security that we have in this country. We're going to have to revisit a lot of our freedoms as a result of this kind of an attack. And then, of course, there's the whole question of retaliation.
This is an
Who is
upsetting,
responsible and what do we do?
Tom, this is an upsetting wire that just came across the transom from the West Bank. It says thousands of Palestinians celebrated Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States, chanting God is great and distributing candy to passers-by, even as their leader, Yasser Arafat, said he was horrified. The U.S. government has become increasingly unpopular in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the past year of Israeli-Palestinian fighting, with many Palestinians accusing Washington of siding with Israel.
For those of you who think that events in far-off places like the Middle East or in Afghanistan or in the subcontinent or in places in Asia have no effect on us, this is the answer today. This place remains an enormous target in the eyes of a lot of people, and we are so vulnerable because of all those things that make us so great, our freedoms and our sense of security that we have. But America has been changed today by all of this.
We want to go and find out more about what's being done for those who were injured in these attacks. Leslie Van Sant is with the American Red Cross. I believe she's joining us from Washington. Ms. Van Sant, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Matt.
Tell me what kind of resources you have available to you to pour into these areas where, obviously, in Lower Manhattan and in Washington, D.C. and outside Pittsburgh.
Well, our chapters on the area are local disaster volunteers. You know, they are, of course, the first people on the scene and responding. Unfortunately, probably now some of them are also victimized by the event. We're also mobilizing 80,000 units of blood to transfer to the regions as needed, and, you know, taking guidance from emergency management personnel on what assistance we can provide to them to make this, you know, response go smoothly.
Is there anything that, I mean, I know it's early after this has happened, but is there anything you can think of that people might be able to help you out with in terms of donating certain things? You mentioned blood and those things.
Well, you know, we're asking people who are in other parts of the country who are blood donors or maybe not blood donors, maybe they could call and schedule an appointment so we can make sure that the supply stays ready. Our disaster volunteers, our mental health volunteers and health volunteers are going to be responding. You know, this will, as Tom mentioned earlier, this is going to be a long, long response. The emotional trauma, the emotional impact is going to be felt weeks, months into the future, even years. So we're going to be working very hard at this for a long time.
All right, Leslie Van Sant with the American Red Cross. Ms. Van Sant, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let's go now to Kathleen Zici of New York University Hospital, which is about 5 minutes away from the World Trade Center, where many of the victims have been brought. Kathleen, I know we spoke to you about an hour or so ago. Can you tell me what's going on in the hospital now? Okay, apparently we're having some problems with Kathleen, and I'm sure it's as chaotic there as it was at St. Vincent's, where we heard from Bob Bazell moments ago that there was a line with Cardinal Egan outside delivering last rites to some of the dead who were brought to the hospital. So we'll try to touch base with Kathleen in just a moment. But first we want to go to Andrea Mitchell once again in Washington. Andrea?
I've been told that the State Department evacuation, Katie, was precautionary only. There was no car bomb, as had at least been reported or rumored, not here on NBC. But in any case, that was precautionary only. There are still some officials there. They are now being redeployed to another location in Virginia. The CIA is still operational. Intelligence officials are still meeting at Langley, but those officials have also evacuated the non-essential employees. The current working theory, as you have been reporting and speculating, is that there is only one terror organization in this world that could coordinate this kind of event, and that would be something operated by Osama bin Laden. Intelligence officials say he is in Afghanistan, where he has been protected by the Taliban, and as we know, the United States has warned the Taliban government of Afghanistan that if there were any attack against the United States, that they would hold Afghanistan responsible, so that we most likely will expect retaliation, military retaliation. But I think right now the full focus of the U.S. government is on finding out how many other possible targets there might be, how many vulnerabilities there might be, making sure that there is no chemical or biological element out there. I spoke to a former Secretary of Defense, Bill Cohn, and others who had been part of the anti-terror operation planning, and they say that those are the first lines of defense to make sure that there is not some other event, unexpected, as this obviously was, that could make Americans vulnerable. Obviously, this is the largest intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. Katie?
All right, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thank you. We're going to check in again right now with Kathleen Zici of New York University Hospital. Kathleen, tell me what the scene is like at your hospital.
Well, we're at NYU Downtown Hospital in Lower Manhattan, and we have had a steady stream of patients coming through the door since the first explosion occurred some hours ago. We have information at this point on 3+ fatalities, plus because there may be additional fatalities that I have not yet been informed of. We have had a severe burn case. One individual is an amputee, a serious neurosurgical injury, a whole range of injuries from both debris, smoke inhalation, respiratory issues related to smoke and debris from the collapse of the two buildings.
So how many medical personnel, Kathleen, do you have working there at NYU Hospital?
We have a medical staff of 500 plus physicians. The entire medical staff has been mobilized, as has the nursing staff, and they are working as hard as it's possible to work.
And tell me again, Kathleen, I know it's hard to estimate how many people you've seen so far?
It's in the hundreds. Our entire cafeteria has been transformed to a triage area, and it is wall-to-wall people at the present time.
All right, Kathleen, thank you very much for that update. I'm sure we'll be checking back with you a bit later on, and thank you very much.
Katie, let's go now to NBC's Bob Hager. And Bob, I think it's important that we recount. A short while ago, we were talking about 4 planes that were unaccounted for. It seems now we know what happened to all those 4 planes, isn't it?
That's it. There's no plane at the moment that we know of that's outstanding that's unaccounted for. And now NTSB is able to match the particular flights to the particular accidents or acts of terrorism. So the two planes that hit the World Trade Center were both takeoffs from Boston, one belonging to American Airlines, and it had been bound for Los Angeles. The other belonging to United Airlines, it too was bound for Los Angeles. Those are the two planes, the American airliner first and then the United plane, that went into the World Trade Center. The other two flights, the one that went into the Pentagon was an American Airlines flight bound from Washington's Dulles Airport to Los Angeles, and the plane that's down southeast of Pittsburgh is a United flight. It had been bound from Newark to San Francisco. I heard one report that it was Newark via Washington National to San Francisco, but I'm not sure of that. Let me tell you the flight numbers. The Boston takeoffs were American Airlines Flight 10. It had 92 aboard. That's one of the ones that hit the World Trade Center.
Bob, let me just interrupt you there for a second, because we've been reporting all morning that it was American Airlines Flight 11.
You know, I'm mistaken. You're right. It's 11. American Flight 11. Thank you very much, with 92 aboard. And then the United Airlines that left from Boston and hit the other World Trade Center tower was United's 175. I don't have a figure on how many on board it. The flight that went into the Pentagon was American Airlines Flight 77, bound Washington Dulles to Los Angeles. There were 64 people aboard it, and the United Airlines flight that went down south of Pittsburgh was United's Flight 93, and there's no number on the number of passengers on it. But again, you have 4 flights known to have been hijacked, known to have crashed, and no flights at the moment that are outstanding that we know of.
Bob, that the crash that you just mentioned near Pittsburgh, I just want to say that that is a United flight that was en route from Newark to San Francisco. Is that accurate?
That's what I have, and I've heard it two ways. It's Newark to San Francisco. I heard one report that there was an intermittent stop that it was to make at Washington's Reagan National, but that's not confirmed, so it might be erroneous.
Yeah, United is now confirming that, apparently, Robert. We also have a report from the mayor of Cleveland, Michael White, saying that a Boeing 767 out of Boston made an emergency landing at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport because of concerns it may have a bomb on board, but no confirmation of that.
We also have, just because I have a personal friend who was flying from Kennedy to Los Angeles this morning, that plane was diverted to Kansas City. So apparently many planes that were en route to certain locations have made special emergency landings in the wake of this, and because of concerns that there may be more problems aboard more airplanes.
And what happens, unfortunately, in situations like this, if the terrorists themselves don't call in to say that there's a bomb on board, you have the twisted minds of other people who call in and say, well, by the way, there's a bomb on board that flight. So it is chaos in the skies for those flights that were already in the air. Other flights have been grounded. This country has been immobilized in terms of where its attention now is focused on New York City and Washington, D.C., the tragedies in Pittsburgh as well. No air travel, no financial markets. All national monuments are being evacuated. The president has been rushed back to Washington, D.C. The Pentagon has been attacked by an airliner, in effect, and on Capitol Hill, code red. The Speaker of the House was taken to a very secure area because he's third in line, succession to the President of the United States. We are, as we have been saying this morning, in a state of war with terrorism.
And as a result, the Army has been placed at ThreatCon Delta. That means that armed personnel will be guarding U.S. installations, not only here in the United States, but in other parts of the world. You're looking at the southern tip of Manhattan Island here in New York City, and for so many years we've come accustomed to seeing the World Trade Center standing there in the background behind the Empire State Building that you see in the foreground. Those two towers no longer stand after a terrorist attack this morning. NBC's Pat Dawson is close to the scene of that attack. Pat,
Matt,
can you hear me?
if we are, yes, I can, Matt. If there is a war against terrorism that started, rather ongoing right now, it started here at about 8:45 this morning, as you described, a big hole in the skyline at the southern end, the southern tip of Manhattan Island, where the two World Trade Center towers have stood for the last 25 years, 110 stories high. They are no longer there. Just moments ago, I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department, who was obviously one of the first people here on the scene after those two planes were crashed into the side, we assume, of the World Trade Center towers, which used to be behind me over there. Chief Albert Turry told me that he was here just literally 10 or 15 minutes after the events that took place this morning. That is the first crash. He said that at one point he had roughly 10 alarms. That would equate to roughly 200 to 225 New York City firefighters who were in the building. This was after the crash, trying to rescue civilians who were in there. Now, earlier this morning on the Today Show, we spoke to the director of the World Trade Center. He said that at that hour of the morning, you could have upwards of 10,000 people in each of those towers. That would be 20,000 people total in each tower. The chief of safety, as I said, chief safety of the Fire Department of New York City, told me that shortly after 9 o'clock, he had roughly 10 alarms, roughly 200 men in the building trying to effect rescues of some of those civilians who were in there, and that basically he received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place, and then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said, there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. One of the secondary devices he thinks that took place after the initial impact was, he thinks, may have been on the plane that crashed into one of the towers. The second device he thinks, he speculates, was probably planted in the building. So that's what we have been told by Albert Turry, who is the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He told me that just moments ago. Now, we are continuing to hear explosions. Here downtown, and what we've been told by some of the fire officials is that there are some gas lines that occasionally are exploding down there, because obviously, as you can imagine, there are a lot of open gas lines down in the southern part of Manhattan where the World Trade Center towers used to be. As far as the situation right here, basically what we have are hundreds of New York City firefighters and other New York City rescue units who are massed here. There is a cordon just down there. We are not sure, to be honest, if some rescue workers have tried to go beyond that point as yet. When we spoke to the head of the Port Authority Police, that would be the organization that is in charge of the World Trade Center building itself, the Port Authority Police chief told us that they were at that point, about, I'd say, 40 minutes ago, about to make a decision on whether or not it was safe to send emergency workers back in there. But the bottom line is that, according to the chief of safety of the New York City Fire Department, he says that he probably lost a great many men in those secondary explosions, and he said that there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people in those two towers when the explosions took place. He said everything above the 60th floor was extremely difficult to get to, as you can imagine.
Pat Dawson.
Back to you.
Pat Dawson, thanks very much. We have some videotape, I understand, that we're going to show you from the West Bank. These are Palestinian celebrations in the wake of Tuesday's terror attacks in the United States. Apparently, Palestinians took to the street chanting, "God is great." People were throwing candy, distributing candy to passersby. The U.S. government obviously has become increasingly unpopular, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because Palestinians feel that the U.S. government has sided with Israel. One man, Nawal Abdel Fattah, wearing a long black dress, threw sweets in the air, saying, actually that's a woman, pardon me, saying she was happy because, quote, America is the head of the snake. America always stands by Israel in its war against us. Meanwhile, Yasser Arafat emerged to speak with reporters, the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He said, "We are completely shocked. It's unbelievable. We completely condemn this very dangerous attack, and I convey my condolences to the American people, to the American president, and to the American administration, not only in my name, but on behalf of the Palestinian people."
And this comes on a day, Katie, in which obviously there's been a steady deterioration of the situation in the Middle East, but Shimon Peres was to meet today with Yasser Arafat in the West Bank. there has been some criticism of the Bush administration for not getting more involved in the peacemaking efforts in the Middle East in the past few weeks from within the Republican Party as well.
Because it has gotten increasingly volatile.
It has. There's been a steady escalation of violence, incursions by Israelis into Palestinian towns and declaring martial law and then pulling back. And everyone thought that the bomb was ticking in the Middle East. No one expected anything of these kinds of consequences to be visited upon this country in this horrific way that we have been witness to today. It is one more example, as we have been saying this morning, of events in far-off places that have such an enormous impact here, because the United States is, in the eyes of so many people who are opposed to our system of government and our alliances, is the devil incarnate. And today this is a very sophisticated, very cold-blooded, very widespread attack carried out with the most chilling kind of efficiency on several of the great nerve centers of our system of government and our way of life.
And we're talking about perhaps thousands of casualties. What's one thing that's very frustrating about reporting this story is we know that many, many people were inevitably very seriously hurt or killed in these explosions. We have 4 aircraft full of people, obviously, that were involved in these incidents, and an untold number of people who were in the World Trade Center at the time, in the surrounding area, and of course those individuals at the Pentagon as well.
And you can only hope that in the time between the actual collision, the planes hitting the towers, and the time it took for those buildings to collapse, that large numbers of people were able to get down the stairs. You'd have to assume that power in the building was probably disrupted. Elevators may not have been usable, that they were able to get down smoke-filled stairways to safety before both of those towers collapsed.
And as Pat Dawson just said, though, from the 60th floor up, it was very, very, very difficult. And there are 110 floors in the Twin Towers each in the World Trade Center. So you're talking about 50 floors, if his estimate is correct, of people. Now, the first explosion did occur at 8:42 in the morning. Some people might not have been at work yet, but many people here in New York, a workaholic town, get to work early, particularly those who are watching the markets, the overseas markets, and this is the financial center of the United States and, of course, of New York City as well.
Yeah, we have hesitated to use specific numbers, but Mayor Giuliani is saying it's a horrendous number of lives lost, and it could be in the thousands.
We want to go now to Ray Kelly, who's a former police commissioner here in New York City. Mr. Kelly, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Obviously, after the terrorist attack in 1993 on the World Trade Center, security was beefed up, but there's nothing that could have been done to prevent this kind of an attack, it seems.
No, it appears that nothing could be done, and of course, events in 1993 pale in comparison to this. This is a horrific event. As the mayor said, it appears to be thousands of casualties. And New York City emergency services, I believe, are the best in the world. But something like this, of course, could overwhelm any emergency service. But I think there is, I guess, some consolation to say that they are the best. And unfortunately, we don't know how many of them have been injured or perhaps killed.
Let me ask you a question about that, Ray. Is it true that the Center for New York Emergency is housed at the World Trade Center?
Yes, that is true. It was shifted there a few years ago. It was up on the one of the, I think about the 7th or 8th floor in one of those buildings. And again, in hindsight, perhaps that shouldn't have been done, but it was a state-of-the-art facility, no question about it.
Well, tell me a little bit more about that facility, if you could, Ray. I mean, what specifically is it designed to do?
It's designed to coordinate. You have 40,000 police officers. You have a fire department with the emergency service, EMS component of about 15,000 people. The purpose of that facility was to coordinate activities in the event of emergencies. And again, it had state-of-the-art communications equipment. And it's something that it's just unfortunate as to where it was located. But there are temporary headquarters. New York City has several of them, and mobile temporary headquarters that I'm sure they're operating out of now.
At the same time, it must be fairly chaotic without the use of that center to coordinate the efforts.
Well, I guess everything is chaotic right now, but the emergency vehicles, I think New York City has a lot of major events, and they coordinate most of those events outside of that center. That center has kind of an oversight responsibility for a lot of the events. The coordination is done on the scene. So they practice doing that.
And Ray, I mean, obviously the problem here is not only do police officers and law enforcement and rescue people have to respond to what's happened at the World Trade Center, but also a large number have to fan out to make sure that nothing occurs at other landmark buildings throughout the city.
That's true, and of course services have to be provided throughout the city. The normal police and fire services, the rest of the city, 320 square miles, have to be covered by emergency services. So it is indeed a tremendous challenge.
Ray, you've been in the middle of these kinds of episodes when you were the police commissioner in '93 during the attack. Your whole life has been dedicated to law enforcement and national security matters. But aren't you stunned by the magnitude of this attack and the complete surprise of it all?
Yes, and the complexity of it. And I think we've relied for years on the relative lack of sophistication on the part of terrorist organizations. We've been very lucky, no question about it. We've had fairly good intelligence information, but then again, we knew nothing about the World Trade Center bombing before it happened. We had terrorists cross into our borders just before the millennium, December 14th of 1999. You can't predict these things. I am surprised, again, at the level of coordination and sophistication of these attacks.
Ray, what kind of game plan is in place? Obviously, following the bombing of the World Trade Center, officials really sat up and took notice and knew that this kind of attack, perhaps not of this magnitude, but another terrorist attack was possible. So what kind of game plan was put in place?
Well, there's tremendous reliance on intelligence gathering. Certainly the FBI and CIA work more closely now than ever in communicating with each other and gathering information with the NSA. The FBI has set up counterterrorism task forces throughout the country. There's now, I believe, 23 of them. New York City was the first. And indeed, that was the entity that did the investigation of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. There's a lot more awareness now than there was in 1993, quite frankly, but obviously didn't prevent a terrible tragedy like this.
All right. Well, Ray Kelly, former New York Police Commissioner. Mr. Kelly, thanks very much for talking with us this morning. We're going to go now to Washington, to Campbell Brown, who is across the street from the White House, which, as we mentioned, has been evacuated. Campbell, what's the latest?
Well, Katie, we're not actually sure at the moment if where exactly the president is right now. He was in Florida this morning. We understand that he was told about the situation while he was in a holding room at the Booker Elementary School, where he was scheduled to do a reading event. He was was informed by his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, by telephone while he was in that holding room of the first incident when the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center. He was actually reading to children when he heard about the second incident, and that was from Andy Card, his chief of staff, who whispered in the president's ear while he was reading to children. We are told by White House officials that he is planning to convene a national security meeting of all of his top advisors. We do know that National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and other key officials are now meeting in the Situation Room at the White House. As we mentioned, the rest of the White House has been evacuated. Only key personnel are allowed there. That meeting began about 9:39, we're told, this morning. Everyone else, again, evacuated. One of the questions, Katie, that we're asking right now, given that no one's been informed where the president is, and this is, of course, deliberate, is whether or not the White House will decide to put him on the so-called doomsday plane. This is a special plane designed for the president in the event of a nuclear attack, and it's far more sophisticated than Air Force One. It has the absolute most advanced electronics, equipment on board. He's able to communicate with anyone at any time and able to command the armed forces from this plane. They're able to refuel it mid-air, and they could essentially keep the president on this plane for an extended period of time. We don't know if that's an option that has been considered or something that they are looking at trying to do right now, or whether or not his plan is to come back here to the White House. The situation where we are now, though, it's fairly desolate because of the evacuation. They've actually pushed the White House staff, evacuated many of the buildings around here, and kept people several blocks away. We're at a hotel just about a block away where we do have a view, but again, only key personnel allowed in the White House at this time. Katie?
All right, Campbell Brown. Campbell, thank you very much for that update, and please keep us posted as things develop there.
Katie, joining us on the phone now is the governor of the state of New York, George Pataki. Governor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Obviously, we're looking at some just devastating pictures of lower Manhattan, similar pictures at the Pentagon in Washington, and another incident in Pittsburgh. Just first of all, your reaction.
Well, it's just a horrible, horrible day. It's an attack upon America, an attack upon New York, and we have to respond longer term to make sure we protect ourselves. But right now, we have to deal with this crisis and try to help the people who are still trapped, still at risk. And we've mobilized our National Guard and statewide fire and emergency services teams, and we're communicating and working with the city, and everything we can do to try to provide support is being done.
After the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, I mean, was there a sense that some of the vulnerability had been eliminated through security measures? I mean, obviously no one can predict an airliner or two airliners crashing into these buildings, but was there some sense that security had been shored up?
You know, you do everything you can. You make sure that people don't get into the towers without being inspected. You make sure that people can't park under the towers, but you just can't be prepared for a plane to fly into one of the towers or two planes to fly into the towers. It's a horrible, horrible situation. Our heart goes out to all those whose families are at risk, and we're just going to do everything we can to respond and be supportive and helpful too.
Obviously, the loss of life is the primary concern right now in helping those who've been injured, but if you will, at least talk to me a little bit about the other impact of this building. This is, for example, as Tom and Katie and I have pointed out, the world financial center, the hub of finances in the world, if not at least here in the United States. What type of damage has been done to the financial infrastructure of this country?
The economic impact is something we can talk about as the days unfold. Right now, we still have to focus on making sure we save as many people as possible, help those who are injured, help with an orderly removal of the people who are leaving downtown and leaving the city. We're going to focus on that and be concerned about what may or may not be the economic consequences once the immediate crisis has passed.
All right, do you have plans to get down to this area?
Yes, I'm in the city, and I've been in touch with the mayor, and we're going to be continuing to do everything we can.
Governor, what about other emergency procedures for the city of New York in the next several days in terms of what's going to remain shut down and so on? A lot of people have this as a destination. A lot of people, millions of people live here.
Tom, right now we do have limited service out of the city. We have both the Metro North and Long Island Railroad running out. We have the George Washington Bridge open. The tunnels are shut for security reasons. We're not having traffic other than emergency traffic come into the city. And I think at this point it would be extremely unlikely that we're going to have many people coming into the city tomorrow. We're going to be continuing to try to deal with the horrendous situation downtown.
Thank you very much, Governor. I know it's been a long and difficult day, and it will go on for you and for all New Yorkers for a long, long time, unfortunately.
Well, our prayers are with the families and the people whose lives are still at risk.
Thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you.
We want to go now, Matt, to Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon. Jim, a lot of these flights were transcontinental flights, heavily loaded not only with passengers but with fuel.
That's right, Tom, and we just learned a few moments ago that the U.S. Navy is dispatching a couple of aircraft carriers from Norfolk, the JFK and the George Washington. One will be stationed off of New York. The other will be stationed in the Atlantic as close to Washington, D.C. as they can get. They'll be there to provide any possible military support that may be needed, including flying any kind of air cover should there be any additional warnings of any further terrorist attempted attacks. Now, as we stood here this morning, you can see the smoke is still billowing. The smoke just in the past few minutes has changed from black to white, a strong indication that they're throwing more water on the fire, as we saw from other vantage points. But the priority now is to get the fire under control. A casualty count is impossible at this point, Tom. As you've seen from the earlier pictures, the plane opened a huge wide gash in the side of the building. We're being told between the 4th and the 5th corridors. It smashed through the E and D rings, and people who were in that area tell me that debris and parts of the plane actually penetrated deep all the way into the B ring. There are 5 rings, A through E. and it entered in the E-ring, so it plowed through a number of the rings. The priority now, as I said, is accounting for the casualties. Medevac helicopters have been flying in and out. You hear the ambulances. Occasionally, we've even seen F-16s flying low routes around the Pentagon and over Washington, D.C., flying those CAPs or air patrol missions that are usually flown in combat. But to see 2 aircraft carriers moved in locations off the United States to provide air cover, Tom, I mean, that's the kind of thing you normally see in a war zone.
Mick, can you tell me, was that chosen randomly where they hit the Pentagon? Can you tell us what the function of those people in that particular ring was, where it was hit?
Well, it's interesting because a number of people, and this really wasn't sarcastic, but they said, well, they hit on the wrong side, because just the opposite side of the building, of course, you have the offices of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. We were on that side of the building when the plane hit. We felt the building shake, the windows rattle, and looking outside immediately saw people on the run. There was pandemonium in the hallways. Now that section of the Pentagon, I thought at first when it was described to me that it may have hit in an area where some of the Special Operations offices are located. The Assistant Secretary for Special Operations is located near there, but the plane actually hit maybe about 60 to 70 feet to the right of that location. In that part of the building, there's it's very near a mall area, actually, where they have a shopping area for Pentagon employees. After all, there are 25 to 30,000 employees in there on any given day. And also in that part of the building, you had many Navy personnel, many reserve personnel. I bumped into many Army personnel who are adjacent to that. They think everybody's all right. The Navy people I talked to said they still had a few people that were unaccounted for. But again, it's going to be impossible to tell exactly what the casualty count is in there until they get that fire under control.
Matt.
All right, Jim Mikoszewski outside the Pentagon, thanks very much. Joining us now is General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the commander of all forces in the Persian Gulf War. General Schwarzkopf, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Obviously, you've seen the footage, I'm sure, of the Pentagon and of southern Manhattan. We haven't seen much footage outside Pittsburgh. What are your thoughts this morning?
Well, you know, it's a very, very sad day for this country. It's really a sad day for the world as far as I'm concerned, and your heart goes out to all those families, and your prayers go out to all those people who lost their lives.
We are fighting a war now, it seems, a terrorist war here in this country. The question is, how do we go about fighting it, General?
Well, you know, that's one of those easy questions to ask and one of those very tough questions to answer. The deterrence against terrorists is almost impossible, because these are people who could care less about their own survival. And normally deterrence is just says, you know, you hit me and we hit you back harder. And in this case, these people don't care whether they lose their lives or not, and therefore it makes it doubly tough to deter. The fact is that the world is getting smaller, and you know, terrorism has come to our shores because we have the ability to span oceans and great distances in a very short time.
Yeah, General, have you been able to talk to anyone at the Pentagon and get some updates on who may have been injured or lost?
No, I mean, the information that I've heard is basically what you all have, and that's it. You know, they didn't hit the very critical parts, and therefore maybe we don't have as many casualties there. But when you look at what happened at the World Trade Center and the number of casualties that they probably have there, it's just horrendous.
General Schwarzkopf, hi, it's Katie. I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously you've been in the military for a long, long time. Have you ever heard, or is this a method of destruction that the U.S. military was aware of and had concerns about, where they would actually, hijackers would use a plane as a flying bomb?
Well, Katie, you know, Tom Clancy wrote a book about just that. Several years ago, he wrote a book about a Japanese pilot crashing his 747 directly into the Capitol building and wiping out the national government. And so it's not something that's new. Obviously, what's kind of shocking is we thought we had good protection against hijacking of aircraft, and what's very apparent today is that something needs to be done about that if this many aircraft can be hijacked all at the same time.
Meaning security at airports across the country, General?
That and many other measures that could be taken, but I mean, it's kind of frightening when you consider the number of aircraft that were simultaneously hijacked and apparently I don't know. I can't say with a pair of these. I don't know, but it did in fact happen, and that's kind of frightening in itself.
Well, also, General Tom Brokaw here, the failure of intelligence here. I know it's always easy to say that at this point, but this is a very sophisticated and obviously widespread, complex operation that was planned. It was very tightly held in the most sophisticated way.
Yeah, Tom, but you and I both know that getting inside the intelligence, getting inside a terrorist group is probably the most difficult type of penetration that you can do. I mean, you've got to have somebody on the inside that can let you know what's going on, and that's not always the easiest thing to do in this type of terrorist organization.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf. We'll be back in touch with you throughout the day as we get more information. We'd love to get your oversight on all of this if we can.
Okay, Tom.
Well, let's go to Paul Bremer now, Ambassador Paul Bremer, who is the chairman of the National Commission on Terrorism. Mr. Ambassador, do we have any idea whatsoever who may be responsible for this?
Well, as you were just saying, we have a massive intelligence failure and a huge security failure that's going to have to be looked into. Analytically, there probably are 4 possible candidates. There's the Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda group that you've been talking about. There is the possibility of a Middle Eastern group such as Hezbollah or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad conducting an attack like this. And there are at least 2 states which at least are capable of such an attack, and that would be Iran and Iraq. So you have probably not more than 4 suspects.
How do we begin to find out who is responsible?
Well, the good news is that the hijacking 4 airplanes is a very complicated operation. Even hijacking 1 is complicated. And they will have left some trail behind them. They will have had to have checked in. They will have had to have purchased tickets either under their name or alias names. They will have had to have showed pieces of identity. There will be a trail that will lead back from the hijackers at some point to the perpetrators. It may take some time, but we'll get there.
You're an expert on national security matters, Ambassador. How is this country going to have to change?
Well, I think it's one of those great challenges of fighting terrorism is to find the balance between being tempted to overreact, but also being absolutely certain, as the President said this morning, that people understand we're not going to take this sitting down. And I think once the perpetrators have been identified, and I believe they will be, the United States will have to retaliate with the full force of its military as hard as it possibly can. This is an act of war. It's an act of war that some have described as a domestic Pearl Harbor. In many ways, it's worse than Pearl Harbor. I think we will probably find the casualties are going to be higher than they were at Pearl Harbor. In Pearl Harbor, we knew immediately who had done it, and we therefore knew what the return address was. It was Japan. Here, we have higher casualties, less certainty as to where the attack came from, and therefore a more difficult response. But there must be a very strong military response to this act of war.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Paul Bremer, who is a longtime colleague of Henry Kissinger and a veteran of national security affairs in this country. This is routine in times like this. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan has condemned what he called the terrorist attack, saying this is a terrorist act. We strongly condemn as the Taliban have given shelter to the Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, of course, and he's been accused by the United States in the past of masterminding these kinds of attacks. So they're at least on the record from a rhetorical point of view of saying we had nothing to do with this.
Let's go to Martin Fletcher, NBC's Martin Fletcher, Tom, who is in Israel right now. Martin, tell me the reaction by the Israelis to this turn of events here in the United States.
Well, of course, everybody has been very, very quick to express complete solidarity with the United States. The Israelis, of course, are very experienced in these kind of things. They've offered to send all their emergency help they can to the United States. They've also, by the way, just closed the Israeli airspace just in case things do spread. But among the Palestinians, there's a different reaction. Yasser Arafat immediately expressed complete horror, condemned the attacks completely, but on the same time, in some places on the streets, in the Palestinian towns, there's been a rather strong expressions of support, of delight even. There were 3,000 Palestinians took to the streets, we're told, in the West Bank city of Nablus, and smaller demonstrations also in East Jerusalem, Tulkarm, Bethlehem, other Palestinian towns in support of the bombers. happy of these few Palestinians at what has happened. But of course, that's just, we don't know how widespread that is, but there have been some clear support, demonstrations of support for the bombings.
But Martin, we should point
but
out...
as I must stress, the Palestinian leader, I should stress that Palestinian leaders all condemn totally the bombings.
We should put into some perspective for us, if you could, Martin, how displeased many Palestinians are with the United States right now about their feelings that somehow the U.S. is siding more with Israeli and what's going with the Israelis in terms of what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, there's complete support across the board belief among Palestinians that the United States and Israel are one. That the United States is together with Israel in the situation here in Israel and the West Bank. They believe the United States completely supports Israel and therefore deserves to some kind of attacks against the United States. There have been many calls here, especially in recent weeks, by the way, in some of the Palestinian media, for attacks against the United States. So there is a great feeling of anger, a great belief that America supports Israel, and a great belief also that Israel, without American support, could not be as aggressive in its retaliation against Palestinian suicide attacks as it is. So
but Martin, that's really
a feeling, strong feeling.
I was just going to say, Martin, that sentiment.
Sorry, Katie, go ahead.
I was just going to say that sentiment is really nothing new. Has it been exacerbated in recent weeks in terms of how the Bush administration has been dealing with the Mideast?
I think it has been exacerbated because throughout the last 11 months of the fighting, there was always a feeling among Palestinian leaders that the worse the fighting got, the more likely it would be that the United States administration would intervene, would try to help impose a solution on the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Palestinians have always wanted an international force to get involved, believing that's the only way to really get to a solution, an imposed solution. And what they're seeing from Washington is, if anything, President Bush backtracking from that, making it rather clear in several statements from American leaders that Israel and the Palestinians should get on with it, and that until there's a real possibility of peace talks, America won't get involved. That's the belief of Palestinians. But of course, I just want to stress that this Palestinian anger, we don't know that has anything to do, of course, with what happened today.
All right. Thank you, Martin Fletcher, in Israel this morning, this afternoon.
I was going to say we have a couple of other developments that we ought to share with everyone. Ripple effect seems like an understatement. The U.S. borders with Mexico and Canada now have been closed. White House sources are saying all principals in the White House, senior Bush advisors and officials like the Vice President and the President himself are either in the Situation Room or in bomb shelters. They will not say exactly where the President is except to say that he is safe. There have been comparisons to Pearl Harbor this morning. 2,400 people were killed in Pearl Harbor on that attack on December 7, 1941. It is likely that the death toll today will be higher. The political magnitude of this is yet to be fully calibrated as well, but as we have been saying throughout the day, this is a new form of warfare against the United States.
And as Ambassador Bremer said, in that case, we had the return address.
Right.
It's still certainly unclear and may remain unclear who was responsible for these absolutely horrendous attacks.
Christian Martin is a producer for Dateline NBC, and he joins us now. Christian, you were obviously down in the area based on your appearance, and I understand you shot some video while you were down there. First of all, tell me how close to the buildings you were.
I was probably about 2 to 3 blocks away, and they were moving most of the folks back. Near me were probably 20 or 30 cops and emergency personnel, and at this point we were thinking, wow, and then suddenly this cloud started moving real fast, as you can see. And it was a dead sprint for about 20 of us. I found the corner, the cloud blew me into a car across the street. I crawled under a car. You could hear, it was pitch black, you could hear chunks of concrete falling all around you.
You were under a car?
I got blown into a car and then crawled under a car.
How difficult was it to breathe at that point?
Very difficult. It was probably pitch black for about 2 minutes. I was covering my mouth. It was, for a while you didn't hear anything, and then you heard a lot of moans and groans. You know, that it was really just a canyon, and the entire force of the blast came shooting down it much faster than you would imagine. As you watched it fall, you thought.
You say you heard moans and groans. Did you see many of the injured around you as when the dust finally settled somewhat, so that you could get out from under the car?
I was really kind of in shock and stumbled around for a little bit. You could see that there were some people there. Everybody that was in the area was pretty affected. There was no emergency personnel helping anybody. Everybody that was there was in pretty bad shape at the moment. And as I started to wander farther and farther away from it, you could see more people coming. The cops and the firemen down there were just incredible, and you know, probably still are down there. So.
Obviously, it was a very frightening situation for you to be in. Did you have any idea? I mean, were they anticipating that because of the size of the hole in this building, that the whole building might come crashing down?
That wasn't my sense. I mean, it was obviously a terrible tragedy, but I felt that I was down in Oklahoma City about 3 hours after that blast happened, and I felt that things were beginning to ramp down. The emergency, obviously there was a lot of tragedy going on, but I felt like the cops and the firemen were sort of beginning to get the situation under control. They were moving everybody back. By and large, the streets were cleared. There was a lot of emergency tape, and then when that started, we were all surprised. You can hear the voices saying, "Move back." I mean, there were a lot of people on the street.
Did you see the triage units at work and people being helped in the immediate vicinity? Because one of our first concerns when this happened was, what about the people who were outside the building who were in serious pain?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what was going on right in the immediate area. I assume there were, I hope there was no one around. As I said, I sort of stumbled away from it, and by the time I got 3 or 4 blocks away and the air cleared enough so that you could see, we were then all being pushed away. But I mean, you could still see the remains of the plane crash from earlier that day. I mean, I shot some video of a huge airplane wheel. There were body parts, you know, all over West Street. I mean, it was insane down there.
Well, Christian, thanks so much for coming by. We're glad you're safe, of course, as well. Meanwhile, we're going to go back to Washington, where Bob Hager is standing by with more information. Bob.
Katie, the word now on these air crashes is there's 266 dead total. That's the rough addition at the moment in the hijacking of 4 planes. 2 of them were United airliners and 2 American airliners. 2 out of the 4, by the way, I'm getting my own voice coming back to me in my ear if somebody can help me on that. 2 of them were American, 2 United airliners. 2 of the 4 took off from Boston, 1 from Newark, 1 from Washington, Dulles. 2 of those planes went into the World Trade Center, 1 went into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in rural Pennsylvania. There are 50 flights that are still in the air at this point. That is 50 commercial flights. The FAA has put what they call a ground hold on all flights in the U.S. So 50 of those flights are still in the air. That means that virtually everybody's landed at this point, and if there's any good news in any of this, they say that at the moment none of those planes appear to be hijacked or in trouble. And they're all very close to landing now, within 40 or 50 miles of an airport, their airport where they intend to land. So that should put them on the ground in the next half hour or so.
Bob, I just want to ask you, Bob, have many of those planes been diverted? In other words, are they reaching their destinations, or are they having emergency or premature landings elsewhere?
Yeah, there is nothing on that. They left it to the discretion of the pilots. They said if you want to go on to your landing, unless you're going to land in New York or Washington, go ahead to your landing if you want to, or you can divert if you choose to do that. So New York and Washington were the only 2 that were closed to incoming flights. I'm now told that there are 22 international flights still in the air. So we have 50 domestic commercial flights still in the air, 22 international flights still in the air, none of those believed to be in trouble, so that it's been more than 2 hours now since the last of these crashes, and hopefully if that word is correct from the FAA, then we've seen the last of this.
Bob,
Again,
I was just going to mention, you know, Peter Greenberg, our travel editor, had an interesting observation that perhaps the airlines that or planes that were chosen were because they had the most fuel. They were planning to travel across country most of those flights. Can you weigh in on that?
It is curious that 3 out of these 4 flights were bound for Los Angeles. They were 757s and 767s.
And the other to San Francisco.
Yeah, but none of them had to fly long distances because the 2 crashes in New York, let's see, those planes came from Boston, and from the second tower crash was, both of those flights were from Boston, the 2 crashes into the World Trade Center towers, and then the crash here in Washington into the Pentagon was a takeoff from Washington Dulles, so that's very close by, and the crash that happened in rural Pennsylvania was a takeoff from Newark Airport, so that was not a terribly long distance.
So I think what Katie's getting to, Bob, is that the planes were loaded with a lot of fuel because they were anticipating a long flight, and perhaps they were chosen because of the damage that fuel would do on impact.
Well, that could be a factor, yes, because you would imagine that a plane with a whole lot of fuel would make a lot bigger explosion than one that was had only a limited amount of fuel left.
All right, Bob Hager in Washington. Bob, thank you very much. So now we know from Bob that there are 266 people dead as a result of those 4 planes. Obviously, this is an unspeakable tragedy for so many families throughout the country, not to mention all the lives lost here in New York City and at the Pentagon. But again, American Airlines Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 77, United Airlines Flight 175, and United Airlines Flight 93. Both American Airlines flights, I understand, were en route from Boston to Los Angeles. The United Airlines flight, one from Newark to San Francisco, and the second from Washington, D.C., actually from Dulles International Airport in Virginia to Los Angeles as well. If you need any information about a loved one on board, these are the following numbers you should call: 1-800-245-0999 or 1-800-932-8555. Those numbers, the first one for American Airlines, the second one for United.
And of course, what we don't know about those flights is what happened in the cockpit. That had to be the worst kind of terror, because they were able to force the plane, 2 of the planes into the World Trade Center and then 1 into the Pentagon. Did they take over controls? Did they shoot the pilot and the co-pilot? Did they have a gun at their head and force them to do this? We don't know, and we don't know whether there's any radio traffic to describe what may have been going on at that time. There's just been one report that they knew there was a hijacking, and they were citing radio traffic at that time. So this only adds to the horror that I think everyone is beginning to feel across this country today about what they try to imagine what has been going on. And it is just beginning, I suspect, for a lot of people to fully sink in about what we're going through. And we are just halfway through this day. And it's going to be a long day and a long week and many months to come as we continue to deal with this. So this is going to be a test of this country, and we're going to have to steel ourselves for some very difficult decisions
Clearly,
ahead.
this was a suicide mission of enormous magnitude, and of course we heard speculation from Pat Dawson at the scene that there might have even been a secondary bomb on board the aircraft, although who knows what kind of explosion would occur if a plane actually crashes in a building that's 110 stories high.
Is it too much to ask? Do we still have that identified? We're not going to do this in a gratuitous way, but to give you an idea of what happened, we have an astonishing piece of videotape of the second plane going into the World Trade Center, and you can see it coming from right to left across the screen. We'll try to play that for you in slow motion. There it is, first real time, and now let's just back it up for a moment and we'll play it in slow-mo so that you can see that in fact it was an airliner.
And when you saw the impact from a different angle, you saw the plane hit one side of the building and then you saw parts of the other side of the building blowing out. So you can only imagine how far that plane traveled through the building on impact. And keeping in mind that we want to talk about the location here. Southern tip of Manhattan, Newark Airport, probably what, Tom, as the crow flies, 10 miles
maybe
to the west and south. Kennedy Airport, another 10 miles maybe to the east. LaGuardia Airport, just to the east as well and slightly north. So air traffic, obviously, it's a congested area, although that was restricted airspace. No planes fly that close to New York City.
Landing gear at the bottom is somewhere in lower Manhattan. It was December 7th, 1941, actually the next day, that FDR said this is a day that shall live in infamy. We are living through another day of infamy for this country.
That was some videotape that was taken by our producer, our Dateline producer, Christian Martin, who was at the scene, Tom, right before that tower collapsed. I'm not sure if he was there before the first tower collapsed or the second tower. I believe it was the first tower. And as we saw, as you mentioned, airline debris, and apparently Christian saw some very grisly things on the scene.
Well, it turns out that President Bush has been diverted to Barksdale Air Force Base, which we believe is in Louisiana, and we expect to hear from him shortly. He has been taken to a secure area. There were reports that he would be taken back to Washington to Andrews Air Force Base. We've been talking about the secure facilities that are available there to him in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Actually, the briefing room in the White House itself is secure, but they've decided to divert him, obviously, to an Air Force base, and he will be addressing the nation shortly. You have in your nation's capital now F-16s flying CAPs, they're called. These are air cover missions over the nation's capital after the plane went into the Pentagon today. So we have never been witness to anything quite like this in the United States within the continental borders of this country. An active war, nothing less than that. There is your nation's capital. It is effectively evacuated from the Capitol building itself down majestic Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. A crisis of grave proportions on this land, and the President of the United States in his first year in office will be addressing the nation, we're told, before too long.
And we would have to assume this would have been true, but a Navy public affairs spokesman now tells WUSA-TV that there are indeed dead inside the Pentagon. We want to go back to Lower Manhattan. NBC's Pat Dawson is standing by there with more. Pat?
Matt, hundreds of people, we assume, hundreds of people based on the information that we've gotten from emergency officials here are still in there. Obviously, we don't know their condition. We have not seen anybody coming out in some time. The question really for rescue officials at this point is when they can begin to move large numbers of emergency service units, either firefighters, police, or of any kind, into that area down there. This area you're looking at here, we are probably about 12 blocks north of where the World Trade Center once stood. This area here has been secured off basically for emergency workers and also for the press. If you just beyond those police barricades, about 50 yards beyond me, is as far as we are allowed to go. And then beyond that, as you can see, literally hundreds of firefighters and other emergency workers who are massed down there. They have bulldozers, they have all sorts of ambulances and the like. But we have not seen more than a handful of ambulances coming out of there in the last hour or so. That may be only that they are not using this particular way out. That is, of course, possible. They may be routing them from other directions. We can't say that. But at least from this direction, we have seen only a handful of ambulances coming out of there. And clearly, there have to be a great many people in there who are either injured or dead at this point. We spoke to a Port Authority police officer, a lieutenant who was in the building at the time just a few minutes ago. The Port Authority, we remind you once again, is the agency that runs those two twin towers, as well as the World Trade Center complex and the airports and the tunnels and bridges around New York City. He said that he had been in the building at the time, that he heard the explosions. He said it was a frightening situation. And at one point after the initial crash of those two airliners into the sides of the buildings, when there were fires blazing, he said that he saw at least a couple of people leaping from high floors, obviously because of the fires presumably behind them. Anyone leaping from a height of that, he said probably at least the 30th floor, obviously leaping to their death. There will be a number of horrible stories. We have already heard many of them so far, but at this point we have basically what we have is hundreds of emergency rescue people who are massed here, and we are waiting to hear when they will be able to go in significant numbers. That's the key thing. A handful may go in here and there, but obviously there are most likely large numbers of people who need help, and we are waiting to hear when large numbers of rescue workers will be able to go in. Back to the studio.
All right, Pat Dawson here in Manhattan. Pat, thank you very much. A bulletin has just crossed that says President Bush says U.S. military on high alert at home and abroad. Again, we believe he is being diverted to Louisiana, and we are waiting to hear word from him. He will reportedly address the nation sometime in the next few hours.
I want to go back to Lower Manhattan. Ann Thompson is standing by with more on the story. Ann?
Hi, Matt. Hi, Katie. I was down trying to get to the World Trade Center about 10 o'clock this morning, and I was walking on Broadway at Fullerton, and suddenly we heard an explosion. It was the first tower coming down, and down Broadway you could just see this wall of debris come flying at us, and I was by myself. I took cover in between a column and the building at 195 Broadway, and we stood there I crouched there probably for about a good 5 minutes. It took that long for all the debris to come by, for the air to clear. When I got up, I was covered head to toe with debris. They opened the building. The gates in that building had been locked. They opened the doors. We went inside. They had evacuated this building, which was some 28 floors of commercial space, right after the first plane went into the World Trade Center. We stood in there, you could see outside, it looked like a war zone. Debris, dust, ankle deep, cars on fire, cars turned askew in the explosion. We decided to stay inside. I was there with some firemen and some maintenance workers of this building. We decided to stay in there because it appeared to be safer inside. Then at about 10:30, it looked like everything was all clear. I started to walk out. I walked down Broadway towards Canal, and we heard a second explosion. I ran back into the building. All the chandeliers shook. Again, we were covered with black debris from everywhere. At that point, a fireman came into the building and said we all had to stay in one place. He then told us all to get out of the building because they felt if there was a third explosion that this building would be in danger. And then I walked down Broadway to Canal Street, and it was like walking through something that looked like out of a movie set of a nuclear holocaust. It was nothing but debris and papers and all parts of buildings down and glass.
Can we please move?
I will,
please.
sir. I will.
Right now, please. Tell the people, please move back.
All right, obviously, Ann Thompson. Ann, thank you very much for that report. Ann's being asked to move her location. Obviously, firefighters and police officers are frantically trying to help those people who have been hurt, who perhaps have not been rescued, or perhaps to retrieve even bodies as a result of this.
So many people in this country obviously in a state of shock over what's happened in several locations, but at times like this you do find people who try to rally to do what they can at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is just south of the World Trade Center, where they've taken a lot of the wounded, 184 patients in total, 10 critical. There are lines now of people who are showing up to donate blood, which is something
heartening in the face of this tragedy. Catherine Hughes is at Virginia Hospital Center, where many of the people who were hurt at the Pentagon, where yet another plane crashed early this morning, is here to tell us what the situation is. Is this the old Arlington Hospital, Catherine?
Yes, it is, Katie.
Can you tell us about the people you're seeing there?
We now have approximately 26 patients. We are expecting more. They're coming in at the moment. We have called in additional surgeons, nurses, and other staff members to help with this crisis. And we've seen basically a variety of medical issues coming in. We do have some in surgery at this time.
So tell me about the medical issues that these individuals are experiencing, Catherine, if you could.
As I said, there are a variety of medical issues, some severe and some not. We do have some cuts, burns, people coming in with shortness of breath. We took our first person at about 10:35 this morning, and they are coming from the Pentagon area.
Catherine, if you could give us an idea, is this the only area hospital that is treating people who are inside the Pentagon at the time of the crash, or have they been diverted to other hospitals as well?
I don't know that. I know that we have already seen 26, and we currently are receiving patients at this time.
A Navy Public Affairs spokesperson has confirmed, or apparently told a local station in Washington, that people have lost their lives inside the Pentagon. And you expect how many more patients, Catherine?
We're expecting patients. We don't know how many. We are just taking them at this time.
All right. Catherine Hughes at Virginia Hospital Center, formerly known as Arlington Hospital. Catherine, thanks so much for talking with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Just to recap where the president was when this occurred, just before 9 o'clock this morning, he was taking part in an education event near Longboat Key, Florida. He was actually, we understand, reading to students down there when he first got word of the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center, and then he was given word that a second plane had crashed into the other tower. He did have a chance to make some comments before heading out of Florida, and here's a sample of what he had to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence.
I want to mention that President Bush is said to have made a couple of other comments. He said that freedom itself was attacked, freedom will be protected, and that the U.S. will hunt down and punish those responsible. Go ahead.
He also said that the U.S. military was on high alert at home and abroad.
Just to update you on the situation, we told you that there had been several international flights en route to the United States. The original plan from the FAA was to divert those to Canada. We now understand that they will be allowed to land in the U.S. The FAA is not saying why they're not going forward with their original plans to divert to Canada, and we don't have any information on the points of origin or the destinations of those 22 planes. NBC's Campbell Brown is standing by in Washington. Campbell?
Well, Matt, what we can tell you is that we do know the president now is at the Barksdale Air Force Base. That's in Shreveport, Louisiana, northern Louisiana. He flew there from Florida, where he was this morning. And it was interesting because in those early minutes, shortly after Air Force One took off from Florida, no one was told within the White House press corps where the president was, where he was going. Our information now is coming from what we call the travel pool. It is one network reporter who is on board the plane with the president. He did make a brief statement. We're waiting to get more on what he said when they landed at Barksdale Air Force Base. We're not sure whether or not he's going to stay there or that they will take the president somewhere else. There are a number of options. Obviously, there's a bunker in Colorado Springs that the military runs. There is the so-called doomsday plane, which is another option. This is an aircraft that is far more sophisticated than Air Force One. It has the most advanced electronic equipment on board where the president could communicate with anyone from that plane. It can stay in the air. It can be refueled in the air. So it is something that was designed and built in the event that there was a nuclear attack, but it is a possible option today if they feel like they need that. Of course, the president, when he was in Florida and initially made those remarks you played a moment ago, he did say he was coming back from Washington, but obviously now they're reevaluating the situation to try to figure out where it may be best for him to operate from. There are a few officials still at the White House now. His National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and other key officials are in the White House. We're told they're operating out of the Situation Room, and that a few areas of the White House have been designated as so-called hard rooms, meaning Special Secret Service agents are there guarding the few key people who are needed to stay at the White House. The rest of the White House has been evacuated. But the president is obviously in close contact with his national security team, who is remaining there for the time being. He was informed of this while he was in Florida at an education event this morning of the first incident when the first plane flew into the World Trade Center. He was told by phone by his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, while he was in a holding room, while he was about to go out and speak to some elementary school children. Then while he was actually reading to these students, a note was passed him from his chief of staff, Andy Card. In the pictures you can see the reaction on the president's face, as shocked as the rest of us at what had happened. And his plans immediately changed, initially to come back to Washington, but now, again, the Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, and we'll be waiting further word on where he will go from here and where he will sort of command the military operations, given the situation. Matt?
All right, Campbell, thank you very much. Katie?
Meanwhile, Matt, Cardinal Egan of the New York Archdiocese is joining us now. He has been outside St. Vincent's Hospital here in Manhattan delivering last rites to some of the people who have been brought to that hospital. Your Eminence, thank you for talking with us. Can you tell us or describe the scene for us, if you could?
Well, I've been here since the very beginning. We have 184 patients here at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan. 10 are critical, and 6 are of the police department or the fire department. So far, 2 have passed away. The situation has been that the doctors and the nurses are waiting outside here. The hospital is completely mobilized, and we believe that we will be able to handle whomever they send. We understand that Bellevue Hospital and St. Vincent's Hospital are the 2 places where they'll be sending the most critically injured, and that they do have triage down closer to the 2 centers. I have to say this, that I've taken care of a lot of people spiritually, anointed a lot of people, and I've no limit to my admiration for what I've seen of the doctors, the nurses, and the staff, and the administration of St. Vincent's Hospital. And I'm told that that is what is to be found throughout this great city of New York. We're addressing this the way New Yorkers address things, with a prayer and with a total commitment to help everyone who is hurting, and especially to make it clear to families and others that we will be doing the very best we can for their loved ones. I have here Dr. Ackerman, if you'd like to speak to him.
Sure, that would be great.
Here he is right now.
Dr. Ackerman, are you an emergency physician there? Dr. Ackerman, it's Katie Couric. Thank you for talking with us.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the situation there and how the patients are doing? I know that you have about 184 patients, is that correct?
That's correct, Katie. And actually the number is growing as the minutes go on. When the first ambulances came in, there were 10 or 11 people in each of them. Now that the triage centers are set up downtown, we're getting fewer patients at the moment, but we're getting the most critically injured. Severe burns, several heart attacks, multiple traumas, many broken bones. And probably what's most striking is that everyone that's coming is coming full of gray powder from the massive explosions that obviously took place. There are family centers set up here at the medical center. There's a special number that family members can call to try to find out if their loved one is here at St. Vincent's. That's area code 212-604-7285. And the New York City Police Department's working very closely with us. We're very grateful that His Eminence has been here to help us and our staff, and we continue to be prepared. I was here for the last major incident with the World Trade Center, and this, in my opinion, is many, many times worse.
Well, Dr. Ackerman, do you have enough people on staff to take care of the hundreds of people who are there already and the other people who may be arriving at your hospital?
We are very well staffed right now, Katie. We are a little bit concerned, though, about later in the day. People will obviously wear down the number of traumas that you can handle, that one can handle not only physically but psychologically, and so we're asking all of the people that call us at this point in time to please check with us around 5 or 6 o'clock this evening, because we fear we're going to need another shift of workers to handle the tragedy of this magnitude.
All right, and we heard that people were standing in line to donate blood, and of course that was heartening news for us to hear under the circumstances. Dr. Ackerman, thank you very much. I know you're very, very busy, so we'll let you get back to work.
Thank you.
You know, Katie, we've been showing basically video of New York and the World Trade Centers, or where the World Trade Centers used to be, and of Washington and the Pentagon, and we've forgotten somewhat to remind people that there was the crash of another plane, a fourth plane outside Pittsburgh, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh, and we don't have video of that story at the moment. That's one of the reasons we haven't been talking about it as much, but that's the fourth prong in this terrorist attack on U.S. soil, and it's just information we'll be trying to get as the day progresses.
In fact, we want to just repeat those airline numbers, which is extremely upsetting news for people who had loved ones on these flights, but we want to give you that information. The 4 aircraft involved: American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles. Then there was American Airlines Flight number 77 from Dulles, Washington Dulles to Los Angeles. And finally, United Flight 93, the plane you just referred to that crashed outside of Pittsburgh, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. It was from Newark en route to San Francisco.
Here are the phone numbers if you'd like to inquire. If you think you had a family member or a loved one on board any of those planes, American Airlines has set up a number at 1-800-245-0999, and United Airlines 1-800-932-8555.
You mentioned that we have not shown shots of Pittsburgh and the United Airlines plane that crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. We have the first shots, pretty shaky video of that airplane that crashed shortly after the 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Tower. At least we got the information. And after that other plane crashed.
This story into short form. This has been perhaps the most devastating day in American history in terms of terrorism. It certainly has been. 4 separate attacks, obviously coordinated fairly thoroughly. 2 on the World Trade Center here in New York, 1 on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a 4th, the hijacking and crash of a plane, as you just saw, outside Pittsburgh. Unclear now as to how many lives have been lost, but the numbers are bound to be staggering as the day progresses.
Aboard those airplanes alone, 266 people have lost their lives. That was confirmed by both United and American Airlines, and we are unclear, as Matt just said, about the perhaps thousands of people who have been killed and certainly injured as a result of what happened in New York City and outside Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. With more, here's Tom.
This is an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.
September 11th, the year 2001, a day unlike any other in the long course of American history, a terrorist act of war against this country. President Bush saying today that freedom has been attacked by a faceless coward and freedom will be defended. Not since Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, has this country undergone such a devastating and damaging attack. And it may not yet be over. We do know at this time that at least 4 targets have been attacked. The 2 Twin Trade Tower centers here in New York City, the Pentagon, and then another plane that was crashed deliberately into an area outside of Pittsburgh. That is the 2nd plane hitting the Twin Trade Towers this morning, all of them hijacked airliners. Then these 2 colossal icons of the American capitalist system collapsed in lower Manhattan. The death toll at this hour is unknown, but it is expected to be, as Mayor Giuliani has said, horrendous. Shortly after those attacks on the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, at the Pentagon, in one of the outer rings, another hijacked airliner crashed into 2 areas there, killing an untold number of U.S. military personnel in Washington, D.C. A code red was put in effect in the nation's capital. The White House, State Department, CIA evacuated along with the Pentagon. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was evacuated to a secure area. President Bush, who was in Florida for an appearance for an education project, was evacuated to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we do expect to hear from him before too long. The United States is in effect in a national state of emergency. All domestic flights were grounded immediately. Most flights that were already in the air, we believe, will arrive safely at their destinations. The borders between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico have been closed. Transatlantic flights were diverted to Canada. U.S. military forces in this country and around the world have been put on the highest possible alert. Aircraft carriers were moved to waters off New York City as this scene played out in the nerve center of this country, lower Manhattan, the financial markets, an area that is home to literally hundreds of thousands of people. They are still dealing with the carnage in lower Manhattan. We want to go now to NBC's David Bloom, who is in Midtown Manhattan, overlooking all of this. As you can see there, communications have been severely interrupted. David?
Well, Tom, what we're looking at behind us more than 4 hours after the first explosion is the smoking hulk of the essentially vanished World Trade Center. As you've said, the essential question at this hour in New York City is how many people may have died in these attacks. The various officials here in New York City believe that the casualty estimates will essentially go into the thousands and thousands of people. Here is the sequence of events as they happened at this hour. The first plane attacks the World Trade Center's South Tower at approximately 8:42 Eastern Time. Airline officials say at least 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked today, and that the attack planes were the hijacked domestic flights. Roughly 21 minutes later, approximately 9:03 Eastern Time, the second large jetliner can be seen taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's North Tower. Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the 2 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling and in some cases jumping from the two buildings. At approximately 9:40 a.m. in Washington, D.C., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, one side of the building collapsing. Non-essential personnel from federal buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol, are evacuated. 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. So again, Tom, 4 hijacked airplanes. We know what happened to each of the 4. Other officials investigating now, both apparently the worst terrorist attack in the mainland United States ever. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom. What we don't know is who may be responsible for these attacks. There's a lot of speculation, obviously, about Osama bin Laden, who is the Saudi dissident who is believed to be harbored somewhere in Afghanistan, but no one is claiming responsibility. In the West Bank, however, the Palestinians in the streets are cheering and celebrating these attacks on the United States, even though Palestinian leaders have condemned the attacks. We want to go now to NBC's Pat Dawson, who is down near the World Trade Center, because the big question, obviously, in New York City and across this country, how many people have been able to survive this horrendous attack? Pat?
Tom, right now, hundreds of rescue workers are massed here on the southern tip of New York in Manhattan Island, waiting for a possibility where they can go back in large numbers to begin searching through the debris. Obviously, the first task at hand will be to find anyone who is still alive in there. There really is no precedent for this. 2 110-story buildings. First of all, the impact of those 2 planes into them, and then the buildings themselves literally tumbling down into the streets. It's the sort of thing that one assumes very few people could have survived. But the task of those rescue workers, and if you look behind me, you can see many of them massed down there. The task will be for them to go back in and to try to find anyone who is alive. First of all, that is, of course, the priority. They know. We have spoken to a number of them. Of course, common sense tells us as well they are going to find a very, very high number of dead bodies in there as well. No way. We have spoken to officials here with the police department and with fire. They all say the same thing. This kind of a catastrophe, there's no way of knowing how many people that they're going to find in there, how many people are dead, how many people are alive. There's really no way to know how difficult their task is going to be going in there and trying to dig through the remains of 2 110-story buildings that are now lying at the bottom of Manhattan. Obviously, taking care of those that are hurt, that they have been able to get out, is a first priority. There are literally, I would say, probably a mile-long line of ambulances and rescue vehicles along this stretch of the West Side Highway in the lower part of Manhattan. Just on the right here is a community college in New York. That college is the triage center for those they've been able to take out. But I can tell you at this point that at least from this vantage point where we have seen most people going in and out, there have been, relatively speaking, very few ambulances going out of here in the last 3 to 4 hours. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, Pat Dawson. One of my colleagues who is right in the middle of the collapse of those buildings is CNBC's Ron Insana, who went down with a cameraman hoping to get close to the World Trade Center, and then it began to come down, the first one. Ron, take us through what you experienced.
Well, Tom, much of the area had been, in fact, cordoned off, and the cameraman from MSNBC and I were trying to get across to the west side of the World Trade Center in order to hook up with the rest of the NBC crews that we knew were there. As we were moving towards the building, we saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We turned and immediately ran for cover in the other direction as debris began to rain down. As we made our way, John going straight down the street, I taking a right turn around a corner, it got increasingly dark. The skies blackened as the material just continued to rain down. I hid briefly behind a car, and as the material got thicker and thicker and it became increasingly difficult to breathe, I got inside a parked car, a random parked car, and hid there basically until the material stopped falling. It was pitch black, black as night inside that car, and for several minutes I remained there until some flickers of light were able to be seen. I made my way to a building and joined some police officers who were inside, and as the blackness began to lift and this gray, thick smoke clung in the air, we were able to find a police car and make our way out of the area. The policeman stopping along the way to pick up 2 injured people and leave them at a Midtown hospital, and subsequently made my way here.
What about collateral damage to other buildings in the area? Those, of course, are the classic canyons of Lower Manhattan, and as that building came down, it did create a kind of tornadic wind that went through there.
Absolutely, much like the images that were created for the movie Independence Day. When New York was exploding, the corridors of Lower Manhattan are so narrow and channel so much wind, even just on a plain windy day, that this material blew through in a way that was really unimaginable. It was truly frightening. It continued to rain down for several minutes, as you can see there, and the winds just whipped through these corridors for several minutes, eventually calming down to such an extent where there was just a thick gray haze throughout the entire area, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was right in the middle of it all today. New York City effectively has been shut down. All tunnels in and out of the city have been closed for security reasons. The airports are closed. The subways are closed. Traffic has been removed from the streets. All hospitals are on extra alert. One right kind of in the middle of it all at ground zero is St. Vincent's Hospital. And NBC's Robert Bazell is there, as he has been all morning. Robert, any additional word on casualties?
Well, Tom, actually there have been about 200 casualties, some of them very severe, at least 8 deaths, and 5 of those were firefighters or policemen. We're not sure of which one. But one of the things that's amazing about being here is that it has been much slower than anyone anticipated. That's a lot of casualties, of course, and but the casualties have been coming out of Lower Manhattan at a much slower speed than people anticipated. I think just because as one rescue worker who had been down there told me, it's just hell down there. You can't move around. You can't discern who's a body part from a living human being in several of the areas. So we have a very dedicated staff standing by. Large numbers of medical workers are ready to attend to anybody who appears.
Bob.
Several have been very severely injured, but we're still waiting.
All right, Bob, we now have the videotape of President Bush, who was diverted from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana. This is what he had to say to the nation moments ago.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President George W. Bush, in his capacity today, not only as President of the United States, but also as Commander-in-Chief, as U.S. military forces around the world are on the highest possible alert. There is so much uncertainty in this situation. Who is responsible? When it could happen again? And where? These are questions that are still unresolved as we try to work our way through this day. I'm joined on the telephone now by the former National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration, Sandy Berger, a longtime veteran of national security matters in this country. Mr. Berger, in all of your contingency planning during your days in the White House, did you ever anticipate anything like this, 4 hijacked airliners that would be driven into the Twin Trade Towers and the Pentagon?
Well, Tom, I think for some time we have known that terrorism is the greatest security threat that this country faced. We've seen some horrible incidents here before. We broke up a multi-pronged effort on Millennium Weekend, but this certainly goes beyond anything that we have seen before in its dimensions and sophistication.
As we work our way through this day of shock and grief and still trying to count the number of casualties, we also have to say, however, that there has been a stunning failure of intelligence at the highest possible level. The American people are going to wonder why they spent billions of dollars of intelligence if we can't find out about a complex operation like this that involves so many people.
Well, I think all of that is going to have to be sifted out. I think that in the midst of our outrage and anger, President Bush is right. We have to show the world that we will respond to this both with determination and with steadiness. That means first, obviously, focusing on security and on rescue, then on determining who's responsible. And this is of such magnitude that it's inconceivable to me that we will not soon know what the origin of this is. And then how we did not detect this, since it obviously involved a multiple operation based on from the United States. But blame, I think, the blame game, I think, comes, in my judgment, after we do everything we can to take care of the people who are in those buildings. We assure the security of others who may be in situations that are vulnerable, and we find out who is responsible for this absolutely horrifying set of events.
Mr. Berger, it's just not a matter of assigning blame. That's not the question. The question is, how do we get our intelligence back on track so it doesn't happen again in the next 20 minutes or the next 20 hours?
Well, I think we have to recognize that this is the overwhelming security threat to the nation, more so than any foreign nation, more so than long-range missiles. Terrorism has been and continues to be the #1 threat to our people. I think the intelligence community has intensified its efforts over the years, but this simply demonstrates that we're certainly not doing enough.
Sandy Berger, thank you very much for being with us today on what is obviously a day of great trial for this country, a great tragedy, and we have to determine how we go from here once we do begin to sort out just how many lives were lost, who is responsible for all of this, and how we can protect ourselves from this kind of attack again in the future as it continues to play out across America. Robert Knowles is on the phone with us now. He was on the 54th floor, I'm told, of one of the World Trade Center buildings when one of the planes was flown into it. Mr. Knowles, you're safely at home?
Yes, sir.
Could you turn down your television? I can hear it in the background, and that will cause us some problems if we continue our discussion. Okay. Tell me exactly where you were and what happened to you.
I was on the 54th floor.
Of #1 building or #2?
#1 building.
And when were you first aware of the attack?
Well, something hit the building, and it knocked me to the floor. And then the whole window blew out of the office I was in. And it snatched the desk out of the office like it was a piece of paper.
And how did you get out of that office?
By the grace of God, I was holding on to the door so I wouldn't be sucked out the window.
And then did you go down the stairs?
Yeah, going down the stairs was really rough because it was from the 30th floor down. It was water. The sprinklers was on, and then I pray to God for the people in the wheelchairs because they couldn't get out. They were sitting there waiting for somebody to carry them down.
How many people did you see like that, Mr. Knowles?
2 people. They were invalids. You know, they couldn't get out the wheelchairs. It wasn't a regular wheelchair. It was the kind of wheelchair where they do everything in a wheelchair.
It was a heavy mechanical wheelchair of some kind.
Yes, sir.
And then as you made your way to the bottom of that stairwell, was crowded with other people trying to get out?
Yes, sir, but God bless the fact that it happened early, because if it had happened at 10:30, it would have been chaos because you couldn't get down the stairs. Between the smoke and the lights being out in the water, and the staircase was slippery.
When you finally got to the ground floor, then what happened?
Then they herded us out of the building. They told us to walk fast. We walked up towards Broadway, up Nassau, and it was glass blown from everywhere.
When you were in your office when the first explosion occurred, that was the first building that was hit?
Yes, sir.
And were there lots of people in the building at that hour?
It was a good amount of people, but not lots.
It was not full to capacity?
No, thank God.
And were there other people who, so far as you could tell, were either seriously hurt or killed in the first explosion that you could find?
No, people. Everybody I seen was mobile. They were able to get out the building. You know, people were coughing, people fell on the stairs. They weren't hurt from the explosion. They were hurt trying to get out of the building.
Okay, Mr. Knowles, we wish you the very best, and by the grace of God, you were able to get out of there, and we know that this has been a difficult time for you, but we thank you for sharing your experience with us today.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Washington now. Senator John McCain, who has declared this an act of war on the United States. It's already being described as a kind of 21st century Pearl Harbor. Senator McCain.
I think that's accurate in many respects, Tom, although clearly the implications of this are very significant, and including the fact that at least we knew exactly who it was that took these actions against the United States at Pearl Harbor. And obviously at this point we don't know who it was or which organization or nation may have been sponsoring this kind of activity.
We're obviously in the early stages dealing still with the shock and the grief, trying to count the number of casualties, but this country will have to take immediate action in terms of how we rearrange ourselves now to hope that we don't have this happen again. We're going to have some profound changes in America, Senator.
I'm afraid so. I think that our lifestyles will not be the same for a very long period of time because of security requirements. I also think that, as I was watching you earlier, there is going to have to be an evaluation about our intelligence capability, and part of that evaluation will be recognition that we don't have the kind of human intelligence capabilities that perhaps we need. We have excellent technical capabilities, but a lot of times you have to have someone on the ground to penetrate these organizations so you can know their intentions rather than their actions. But look, this is a terrible, unspeakable act. I believe the American people will rally behind and support the President of the United States, and I believe that we will find out who did this, and I think we will respond. And I don't know how you could describe it, very frankly, any other way but an act of war.
You grew up in the conventional military, and we have such an investment in all of that, but for